the few of us, but nevertheless, it could be more a conversation and discussion. I'm very delighted to have the privilege to present Professor Donald Rothwell for a talk on the issues of nuclear weapons-free zone in the Southern Pacific, in particular Australia, New Zealand, and the like. I just looked at Professor Rothwell's resume. It's very, very impressive. He's professor of international law for many, many years, one of the most prominent in Australia. For the last 15 years or so at the Australian National University, before the University of Sydney. Expert primarily on a variety of issues that had to do with the unique strategic location of Australia, New Zealand, South Pole, law of the sea, and the like. He has written and edited and authors just about 20 books, over 200 or so publications. That's quite impressive in academia. And indeed, I'm very, very delighted to present Professor Rothwell. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Professor Cohen, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here at the James Martin Centre for Non-Proliferation Studies this week, where I'm visiting to undertake research on a new book that I'm working on. Can I especially thank Lauren Kay for her hospitality and welcomingly so warmly this week. You might find this remarkable. This is actually my second visit to Monterey this year. I was here in April as a visitor, and I liked it so much that I decided to try and come back. So thank you. It's been wonderful to be
first visit was private or
private? Yes. So it's wonderful to have been back here.
We're all lucky to live here.
So what I wanted to do was for a US audience, bring together something, an update, if you like, on nuclear free zone issues in my part of the world, but issues that I think have a great deal of relevance to the United States, and I think also for this particular centre. And so the way I'm going to approach it is to, first of all, look at the background with respect to nuclear free zones and the development of that in Antarctica, and then look at the South Pacific. And then having provided that foundation, I'll then move on to look at some emerging threats and try to draw some conclusions in relation to these matters. So let's first of all start off with Antarctica and a bit of diplomatic history, if you like. And it's always important, just as a gentle reminder, there are no polar bears in Antarctica, but there are penguins. And likewise, there are no penguins in the Arctic, but there are polar bears. So just to get your bearings right in that regard. So let's position ourselves in terms of the Antarctic continent. And this is a fairly traditional depiction of Antarctica. That's unusual in the sense that it shows a whole continent, but it shows the continent with the multiple territorial claims that exist over the Antarctic continent. And there's a number of distinctive aspects of that. The first is that all of the territorial claims emanate from the South Pole. So the claims are generally referred to in Antarctica as sector claims, as if you're dividing up the portions of a pie. And that's why they're so distinctive compared to the way in which we think about territory and boundaries in other places. The second aspect is that some of the claims overlap.
Some of the claims are?
Some of the claims overlap. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily relevant to the discussion today, but the claims of Argentina, the United Kingdom, and Chile overlap. And then thirdly, there is a sector in Antarctica which is not claimed by any particular state at all. And this is what's commonly referred to as the unclaimed sector. So if you look on the map there, you can see just close to the continent where it says South Pacific Ocean, there are no clear defining lines around that particular sector of Antarctica. So it's a territory, it's a portion of Antarctica that is not subject to any particular claim by any state.
Just a tiny question of clarification. Can you say something about percentage of who claims and how much? And also how much of the claims are contested, how much are relatively accepted and settled, so to speak?
Certainly. So the Australian claim to what's called the Australian Antarctic Territory comprises 42% of the Antarctic continent, and that is the largest of the territorial claims in Antarctica. The French claim is the smallest. I don't have a percentage, but it's the smallest of the 7 claims. And in terms of recognition...
And how many are there? How many
7
claims?
7, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In terms of...
Including South Africa?
No, there's no South African claim. So the claimants are Argentina, Australia, Norway, France, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom and Chile. So 7 claimant states, and I'll come to the United States a little bit later. And in terms of the recognition of the claims, the claims are only reciprocally recognised, reciprocal in the sense that the claimants jointly recognise their own claims by a total of 4 states. So the claims are not widely recognised at all by the international community. However, as I'll say in a moment or so, that issue has been really neutralised, if you like, for the purposes of the Antarctic Treaty.
Is this the word that commonly used, claims, rather than, territorials? That's, the reference in the international community is claims?
Yes, yeah, the term claim is predominantly the one that's used. And so I've sort of already briefly observed about the Australian claim in Antarctica. The Australian and New Zealand claim in Antarctica has historical roots in claims originally asserted by Britain, predominantly through British exploration in Antarctica in the late 19th and early 20th century. So there's a commonality, a connection between what are now the claims of the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. And this was a mock-up, if you like, a depiction of Australia formally declaring its claim over the Australian Antarctic Territory in 1933. So this is a sort of a diplomatic snapshot, if you like, of the Antarctic Treaty, which I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. So I've spoken about the background to claims to Antarctica, and all of that changed very much as a result of the negotiation of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959, which was an initiative of the Eisenhower administration. And this treaty came about as a result of what was known as an international polar year, a year in which the international scientific community gave a lot of focus and attention to scientific research in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. And as a result of the enormous success of the scientific research and the advancements that were undertaken during that particular period, which was in 1957, 1958, and a push by the scientists to try to maintain momentum for the capability to continue to engage in scientific research in Antarctica outside of the context of Cold War tensions. The United States proposed a meeting in Washington, which was held in October, November 1959, and ultimately resulted in the conclusion, in other words, the negotiation of the Antarctic Treaty, which was concluded on the 1st of December 1959. And you can see there that the treaty entered into force relatively quickly in June 1961. And the original parties to the treaty were a very small group. They included the 7 states that I've already spoken about who assert claims to Antarctica, and then 5 others: the United States, the then Soviet Union, Japan, Belgium, and South Africa. And those 5 other states were all states that had been very actively engaged in the scientific research programs in Antarctica in 1957, 1958. So this treaty enters into force in June 1961, and over the decades, it's expanded to now include a total of 56 state parties, of which all of the UN Permanent 5 member states are parties, which means that China has now also become a party to the Antarctic Treaty, and that's relevant to some of the points I'm wanting to discuss a little later. So here's a depiction of the Washington Conference, and this is seen as being a great diplomatic achievement. And I guess for the purposes of what we're talking about, it really is, because this treaty was negotiated during the middle of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were major parties to the negotiations and were able to reach agreement on the Antarctic Treaty. And as we'll see in a moment, some of the provisions of the treaty are really quite seminal in terms of dealing with nuclear issues. So I'm not going to take you through all of the various elements of the Antarctic Treaty, albeit a very short treaty, but I want to focus on those aspects which I think are relevant for our deliberations today. Just looking here at the preamble of the treaty, it talks about Antarctica being used exclusively for peaceful purposes, and that it should not become the scene or object of international discord. So obviously reflecting some of the key principles of the United Nations Charter, and also seeking to continue to promote scientific research in Antarctica, which, as I said, was a driver for the negotiation of the treaty in the first place. So some of the really critical and really novel provisions of the treaty, which are not critically relevant to this discussion today, but which you perhaps need to have some awareness of, are the provisions dealing with sovereignty and territoriality. And they're embodied in Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty. And obviously one of the issues that existed for any country becoming a party to the treaty was, well, if they became a party to the treaty, what was the issue with respect to sovereignty? Given that sovereignty was unresolved, there was a portion of Antarctica that wasn't the subject of a territorial claim. We were in the middle of the Cold War. Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States had major interests in Antarctica. What was the prospect of those Cold War tensions really erupting in Antarctica? So Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty contains a formula which tries to, I use the term, neutralise sovereignty and territorial issues for the duration of the treaty. And so this provision here basically provides a reassurance to countries like Australia, who, as I've said, is the largest claimant in Antarctica, but also to the United States in terms of possibly reserving a position to make a claim to Antarctica, that whatever they do their position is not impacted, impaired, compromised by becoming a party to the treaty. And so we come back to this image here, and that basically the effect of Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty was to, and I'm using this term quite intentionally, to really freeze those 7 territorial claims, to maintain the status quo with respect to those 7 territorial claims as they existed at the time that the treaty was negotiated in 1959 and at the time that the treaty entered into force, which was 23 June 1961. Now, the image that you could also see alongside the image showing the territorial claims is a depiction of the scientific research bases that are scattered across the Antarctic continent, recalling that it was critical for the promotion of the treaty, the advancement of the treaty, that Antarctica continue to be used for scientific research. And the way that you do that, historically and even today, is to establish a scientific research base, a scientific research station in Antarctica where you can have a permanent presence on the continent, a permanent presence on the ice in which you are able to undertake your research. Now, those research bases, as you can see, are spread across various parts of the continent, and therein lies some of the tension that may exist with respect to some of the issues I'm going to turn to a little later. So, continuing on the discussion about Article 4 of the treaty, Article 4 says that nothing that occurs while the treaty is in force provides a basis for a territorial claim in Antarctica. Nothing supports or advances a territorial claim. So if your territorial claim is somewhat fragile or somewhat uncertain, well, then Article 4 of the treaty says, well, nothing that occurs while the treaty is in force advances that. Likewise, for the United States, nothing that occurs while the treaty is in force diminishes any potential claim that the United States might have had to make a territorial claim in Antarctica. And then finally, the final sentence, no new claim or enlargement of an existing claim to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica shall be asserted while the present treaty is in force. So that comes back to my sort of snap freezing analogy, that the intention of the treaty was to freeze sovereignty as at the time that the treaty was concluded, to diffuse, neutralise sovereignty tensions, to allow the scientists to go on with their research programs in Antarctica. And as a general observation, that's been particularly successful. However, from a US perspective, the United States was always one of the largest players in Antarctica, always had some of the most significant current scientific presence. Yes, yeah. So this is the largest research base in Antarctica, which is the McMurdo Station in Antarctica, which is located within the New Zealand claimed Ross dependency.
How many people live stationed there?
During the summer, McMurdo can have up to 2,000 personnel present. Interestingly, McMurdo is really resupplied through an air link that comes out of Christchurch in New Zealand. And as I said, the McMurdo base is located within the New Zealand claimed Ross dependency. So in addition to McMurdo, which I said is the largest of the research bases, the United States also symbolically operates the Amundsen Scott base, which is at the South Pole. This is a much smaller base. It's the most remote scientific base in Antarctica, but it's a significant research base just because of where it's located. The flags there are the flags of the original parties of the Antarctic Treaty. but it's also clearly symbolic because the United States maintains this presence at the South Pole and is clearly a significant marker in terms of US presence and engagement in Antarctica.
And how many people are there?
It's a much smaller base. It's just got a couple of hundred that would operate during the summer, and during the winter it would be a much smaller complement of research, because during the winter, of course, daylight hours are minimal, and the ability to engage in research outside of the base is very much compromised. So I've given you sort of an overview of some of the key aspects of the Antarctic Treaty, but I now want to move, I guess, to the critical aspects that are relevant to the presentation today. And that's reflected in the following articles, of which perhaps Articles 1 and 5 are really the most interesting and relevant, I think. So Article 1 of the treaty reinforces this peaceful purposes aspect of the treaty, which I spoke about in terms of one of the drivers for the conclusion of the treaty. And if you read through the first paragraph of Article 1, and that's reinforced by the second paragraph, it makes it quite clear that activities of a military nature, such as the establishment of military bases and the like, the carrying out of military manoeuvres, the testing of any type of weapons, are not to occur in Antarctica. Now, once again, this is a treaty that was concluded during the middle of the Cold War. There was a lot of interest in the potential for possibly carrying out nuclear weapons testing in Antarctica, because whatever nuclear weapons testing you could undertake in Antarctica could possibly have significance for understanding nuclear weapons and their use in the Arctic, a much more prominent and probable place where nuclear engagements would occur. So Article 1 is really quite critical in terms of denuclearizing Antarctica and also making it clear that the continent is to be demilitarized. And then we move to Article 5 of the Antarctic Treaty, which further reinforces the point that I've made, referenced in Article 1, in terms of there being no nuclear explosions, no nuclear testing, and no disposal of nuclear waste in Antarctica. Now,
just one clarification, but does it mean that there is a prohibition to have any weapons on the soil of Antarctica, or it's not as strong?
It's not completely clear in that regard, but it would certainly be asserted that the positioning of any nuclear weapons in Antarctica would be contrary to the provisions.
No, I understand,
of the treaty.
but weapons in general, is it not prohibited, or it's allowed in some perspective? What's the...
Well, I guess one of the interesting emerging debates is the development of dual-use technology and whether or not dual-use military civilian activities being conducted by some states in Antarctica are an infringement, perhaps more of Article 1 of the treaty. So that goes to the peaceful purposes dimension of the treaty. So Article 1 was clearly tested during the Falklands War because of the direct military hostilities between Argentina and the United Kingdom. And Article 1 held during the Falklands War, notwithstanding the fact that Argentina and the United Kingdom have disputed territorial claims in Antarctica, but they ensured that all of their military operations were to the north of the Antarctic Treaty area. One interesting aspect of this nuclear issue was that the United States had actually built a very small nuclear power capability to power the McMurdo station that I showed you previously. And that operated for a short period of time during the 1960s. But the United States eventually decided to decommission that because of criticism that it was receiving about that activity, and also, I think, concerns about the environmental issues that would eventually arise with respect to how that plan could operate. So that was a sort of short-lived issue, and no other state has sought to develop any nuclear power capability in Antarctica since that point in time. So just to wrap up on some other sort of final points about Antarctica before I switch to the Pacific, the area of application of the treaty is important to understand. It clearly encompasses the whole continent, but it also encompasses the Southern Ocean out to the area of 60 degrees south. And so the outer limits of those circles around the continent reflect that area of application out to 60 degrees south. This is a snapshot in terms of who the 56 Antarctic Treaty parties are. I've spoken to you about the 7 claimant states, the other original parties, so that makes the original 12, and then 44 other state parties have joined since the treaty entered into force, and you've got a sample there of the states that are parties. As a general rule, you could say that the state parties are predominantly drawn from Europe and Latin America. Latin America because of the strong Chilean, Argentinian interest, and the interest of other Latin American states in Antarctic affairs, such as Brazil. Not so much interest in Asia from Asian states with respect to the Antarctic Treaty. China prominently has joined, as has South Korea. And there's only one African state, and that's South Africa. And then the final slide at this point with respect to Antarctica just goes to the development of what scholars and even within the treaty framework is called the Antarctic Treaty System. So the original treaty from 1959 has been expanded through supplementary and additional conventions. Many of them have different acronyms, but the predominant trend has been to provide greater environmental protection over Antarctica and also to deal with resources. And it's done that by way of providing for a convention for the regulation of fishing and marine living resource activities in the Southern Ocean. That's the Camelar Convention from 1980. A minerals convention was negotiated, but that was abandoned and has never entered into force. And then in 1991, a protocol to the treaty was adopted called the Madrid Protocol, which is designed to provide for comprehensive environmental protection and prohibits mining in Antarctica. So the treaty system, as it's expanded from that original relatively short treaty in 1961, doesn't really address nuclear issues because the nuclear compact, if you like, the prohibition on nuclear testing, the prohibition on nuclear weapons, the prohibition and the constraints on military activities has generally seen to have held throughout the duration of the treaty. So the additional elements have had an environmental or resource dimension to it. So with those foundation comments about Antarctica, I'm now going to turn to the South Pacific.
Tiny question still about the treaty. Does it have any duration, or it was indefinite? Because you said something about the duration of the...
Yep. The treaty is open-ended and has no time limit imposed on it. Interestingly, there was a provision in the treaty in which it could have been subject to amendment or review as from 1991, but that never formally occurred. But you'll notice there the dates on the slide that the Madrid Protocol was adopted in 1991, and many sort of treaty observers take the view, well, the decision to adopt a comprehensive environmental protection regime for Antarctica and to prohibit mining was effectively a sort of form of review of the treaty that occurred at that point in time. Mm-hmm. So let's move to the South Pacific, and there are two maps here. One is to show you the South Pacific in terms of the dominance of one continent, Australia, but then the scattering of many large and small and very small islands throughout the region. And then the adjoining map tries to give you a better positioning there of the Asia Pacific, as that term has been called, but perhaps now increasingly is also being referred to as the Indo-Pacific. And I guess if you look hard enough there, you'll be able to see Monterey off the US coast. So in terms of thinking about the Pacific and nuclear issues, of course, we have the prominence of the use of nuclear weapons in Japan in 1945 in the Northern Pacific. But in terms of the Southern Pacific, the region was really actively used for nuclear testing programs from 1946 onwards. So the British conducted nuclear testing in parts of Australia, and then the French and the British and the United States conducted nuclear tests throughout various parts of the South Pacific. And so that obviously created a significant legacy in terms of the issues arising from that, but also created some particular legal issues which ultimately led to some of the major developments in terms of the current framework for the prohibition of nuclear weapons in the South Pacific. So France had a long history of conducting nuclear tests throughout the South Pacific, and in particular in the French overseas territories of French Polynesia. And the conduct by France of nuclear weapons testing, and these were atmospheric nuclear tests in the 1960s and the early 1970s, gradually began to attract more and more attention amongst governments and amongst emerging civil society actors, certainly in countries that were beginning to become much more aware of the environmental and associated consequences of nuclear tests. And I can share with you that as a child, growing up on the east coast of Australia in the early 1970s, there was even concerns about nuclear radiation and nuclear fallout with respect to the potential that could impact milk that children were drinking in school programs. We used to, when I used to go to elementary school, we used to be given free milk every day to help us to grow into healthy young Australians. And there were concerns raised about the possible consequences that this could be as a result of the radioactive fallout from these nuclear tests occurring, as you can see, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, quite some way from Australia. But there was concerns in terms of the prevailing winds possibly bringing some of that fallout to the Australian coast.
What's the distance? It's roughly 2,000 miles.
Yes. It's quite some considerable distance, and I'm living proof that there was no adverse effects, and there's been no recorded adverse effects. But I'm just trying to give you a sense of the concerns that began to emerge during that particular period of time.
How many tests the French conducted?
I can't confirm the precise numbers, but there were quite a numbers, as I said, in late 60s, early 70s. So the tests were conducted in uninhabited parts of French Polynesia, and in particular in and around Mururoa Atoll. And in Australia, the election of a Labor government in Australia in 1972 was a real turning point in terms of Australian foreign policy seeking to explore ways in which the legitimacy of these French nuclear tests could be challenged. And so what we saw rather remarkably, but which has begun to be a trend, was that Australia and New Zealand joined together. This was the first time that these two countries had joined together to commence legal proceedings in the International Court of Justice, the so-called World Court located in The Hague, in which Australia and New Zealand sought to challenge the legitimacy of the testing by France of these nuclear weapons. And those proceedings in the International Court began in 1973. As I said, this was an election commitment of a newly elected Australian government. And there was initial success by Australia and New Zealand before the International Court, in which what were called provisional measures or injunctions or interim orders were issued against France that they stop this testing program. And then France indicated that they would completely cease their atmospheric nuclear weapons testing program, and the court was prepared to accept effectively the assurances of France that this was the action that they were going to take. So as a result of that, the legal issues that Australia and New Zealand were advancing were rendered moot. In other words, there was no longer a legal issue. But at a diplomatic level, this was seen to have been successful because France had stopped its nuclear weapons testing program. Now, remember that I said
not just above ground.
Well, this is the critical point, because this was atmospheric testing. So we then moved to a second phase because, as you're alluding to, France resumed nuclear weapons testing in the South Pacific, and now they were undertaking underground nuclear weapons testing, once again within the Mururoa Atoll area. So New Zealand sought to recommence these legal proceedings in the International Court of Justice in 1995. New Zealand was unsuccessful in being able to recommence these legal proceedings, and the reason for that was predominantly technical jurisdictional issues before the International Court. But it was one of the first instances in which a case in the International Court in The Hague was the subject of global media and television attention, because New Zealand's a relatively small country. I can say that because I'm an Australian. That's an in-joke between Australians and New Zealanders. But New Zealand was seen to be taking on, a P5 nuclear power in the International Court, and so it received a lot of media attention. And even though they lost at that phase, as you'll see, there were some repercussions arising from this.
And Australia left this?
Australia allowed New Zealand to take that case on its own. Yeah, and there were a number of political reasons for that. However, there's a parallel story associated to French nuclear tests, and that parallel story is the conclusion of the Treaty of Rarotonga. So, following the success of the first nuclear test cases and France's decision to halt atmospheric nuclear tests, Australia and New Zealand, along with Pacific Island states, began to promote for the development of a nuclear-free zone in the South Pacific, and that eventually resulted in the negotiation of the Treaty of Rarotonga, which establishes the South Pacific nuclear-free zone, which you can see here by way of the map and the area that it encompasses. It's an enormous area of the Southwest Pacific. It extends all the way down to the upper limit of the Antarctic Treaty area. It extends across parts of the Southern Ocean. It encompasses all of the Australian continent and all of the major islands in the Southwest Pacific out really into the Central Pacific. So the Treaty of Rarotonga prohibits all nuclear tests, prohibits the prohibition, places prohibitions on the use and possession of all nuclear weapons. The principal parties, of course, being all of the states within the region, but it also had some interesting provisions which sought to include and encompass and invite the colonial powers, if you like, the external powers who had territory within the region to also become parties. And the two most prominent were the UK and France. And interestingly, partly as a result of the processes that I've spoken to you about, France eventually becomes a party of the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty in 1996, and that really brings to a complete halt all of France's nuclear testing activities in the South Pacific and in French Polynesia. So that's sort of the end of the nuclear weapons testing story, if you like, in the South Pacific at that time. And that then sees this image here, which is partly reflected in the Treaty of Rarotonga map that's up there on the wall, in terms of the way in which the checkerboard map of nuclear-free zones comes together and interacts, including the Antarctic area, as I've spoken about, and also the South Pacific. So to that end, obviously this is quite a success story in terms of the South Pacific being a nuclear-free area, subject to what I'm about to talk to you about. So I've given you the foundations then in terms of Antarctica and the South Pacific. So now I want to talk about sort of contemporary issues and threats and why these areas are coming back into focus in terms of nuclear issues and security issues in particular. So when we come to Antarctica, that there's been a lot of attention given in the last decade to the activities of China and Russia, in particular in Antarctica. And you've seen one of these images before, which shows you the major scientific research bases scattered across the continent. And the image on the right shows you the Chinese research stations that have also developed. It needs to be said that the Russian bases predominantly predate the treaty from 1959, remembering that Russia was an original party to the treaty. All of the Chinese bases post-date the treaty, and the Chinese bases have been developed since the 1980s onwards. And there's some growing alarm about the way in which the Chinese research stations have been built in Antarctica. So there's two observations that need to be made about that. China doesn't need to ask anyone permission to build a research base in Antarctica. The treaty seeks to promote the freedom of scientific research, so they can build a research base where they see fit. The only limitation is the environmental limitation, and that's as a result of the 1991 Madrid Protocol, which places environmental constraints on how research bases can be built and where they might be built because of the environmental issues that might arise from them. But 3 of those Chinese bases have been built within the Australian Antarctic Territory, the AAT, and that's begun to generate quite a bit of interest and concern in Australia. And if you look at the Terra Nova Bay base that China is planning, that's in the New Zealand Ross Dependency, which is not that far from the US McMurdo base. So you'll appreciate then the concerns beginning to be raised about, well, what are China's intentions in Antarctica? Does China have intentions to potentially make a claim, a territorial claim in Antarctica? Is it potentially positioning itself with respect to asserting claims and rights to various minerals? And then we have this development
Just
here.
One tiny question of clarification.
Sure.
So when China started to build up those stations, those settlements, it was unilateral, or they needed some consent of others in terms of the exact location? I mean, or it was unilateral, we're going to have a station here, so we'll have a station here?
Unilateral to the extent that they needed to comply with the relevant environmental requirements. So you couldn't just build a scientific research base in the middle of a penguin colony, obviously, because of the environmental devastation that would cause. But providing that the building of the research base met the relevant environmental standards, they could build it without having to seek permission from a claimant state. They don't need to seek permission from Australia to build the research base in the Australian Antarctic Territory. Now, obviously, there are constraints on on how many bases that you can build, because you need to resupply those bases. You need to be able to have access to those bases. And there are very few airstrips in Antarctica. And most countries can only really operate in Antarctica with the cooperation of what are called gateway states. A gateway state is a state which has a port facility which allows vessels to depart from their port to Antarctica. And there are really only five gateway states, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, and Chile. So unless you have the support of those countries in which your ships can go there and refuel and resupply before they make the journey across the Southern Ocean, your ability to really operate in Antarctica is really quite compromised. Having said that, there are some interesting questions emerging about the role that South Africa is playing in relation to some of those matters. So the interesting development is the following, and that is that towards the end of September, Iran made this rather extraordinary statement saying that they were proposing to set up a research and military base in Antarctica, and that Iran believed that they had the ability to assert a territorial claim in Antarctica. Now, this was sort of a left field development. To my knowledge, Iran hasn't expressed any interest in Antarctica up till this particular point in time. And there's a lot of uncertainty as to how bona fide this proposal is. But if it is bona fide, exactly what are Iran's intentions with respect to Antarctica, given that, as I said, most of the countries who are active in Antarctica come from certain parts of the world, and really there's very little interest in Antarctica from the Middle East. So we'll have to wait and see, but I guess some Antarctic scholars like myself would view this with some alarm, given that Iran doesn't necessarily have the best track record for adhering to a sort of a rules-based international order, which the Antarctic Treaty has very much been founded upon. So let's
except the statement, there was any action. It was just a statement.
Just a statement. Just a statement. Yeah. Like, obviously, the obvious question is, well, actually, do they have any capability to actually send a vessel to Antarctica? Because you just can't, send a normal ship to Antarctica and hope that you're going to get down there. So the issue of capability is quite clearly a live one. So let's move on to AUKUS and nuclear-propelled submarines and the big issue in the South Pacific at the moment. So in September 21, the Australian, UK and US governments announced the development of this new security cooperation framework called AUKUS, which is an acronym involving the three countries. And at the time that the announcement was made, there wasn't necessarily an enormous amount of detail associated with it, other than that Australia would end up acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. And that was the big takeaway message, and that was obviously the significant focus of attention, certainly in Australia. But there are other aspects of AUKUS in terms of military and security cooperation, in terms of space activities, and also cyber activities. This announcement in Australia was met with surprise, because it was something that had been a tightly held secret on the part of the Australian government. So most people like myself woke up one morning and were told that the Australian government was committing to this. And so since September 21... And
you had to deal with France, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes. And the comment there is because France had a contract to build conventionally powered submarines, and as a result of the AUKUS announcement, the Australian government cancelled the contract with France, which impacted relations with France there for a little while. So in the 2 years since AUKUS was announced, we've had some more content announced with respect to AUKUS. And so we had a sort of significant sort of relaunch, if you like, of AUKUS in San Diego in March of this year, in which the President and the two Prime Ministers got together to put more flesh, if you like, on the proposal. So the critical points that come out of where AUKUS is at the moment is that the United States has agreed to transfer to Australia a number of Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines. That transfer is to occur in the early 2030s, subject to congressional approval and subject to precise determinations in terms of the actual numbers of the submarines that Australia will acquire through that particular program. That's the first phase, if you like. But the second and much more significant phase of the AUKUS program is the building by the United Kingdom with US technology of a new AUKUS-class nuclear-powered submarine fleet, which would be a new submarine fleet for Australia and the United Kingdom. Those AUKUS-class submarines will be built into the late 2030s, and as I said, they will be built in the United Kingdom, but US technology is going to be critical to the development of that particular capability. Now, AUKUS raised significant alarm bells in Australia and within the region, given the whole nuclear policy, nuclear free zone position, anti-nuclear position that Australian governments had sought to promote and develop over quite a number of decades. And so what we've seen since September 21 and since March 23 is the Australian government in particular seeking to reassure its partners in the South Pacific in particular that Australia is not walking back on its anti-nuclear position, and that all Australia is doing here is acquiring a nuclear-powered capability and not a nuclear weapons capability. So just to give you some examples of that, this here is a statement issued by the Australian Foreign Minister, Senator Penny Wong, in January, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the NPT. And as you can see from the headline, AUKUS won't undermine Australia's stance against nuclear weapons. Interestingly, if you closely read President Biden's comments at the San Diego launch event in March, the president reaffirms this position, tries to reassure the world that Australia will not be acquiring nuclear weapons as a result of the AUKUS program. But diplomatically, Australia is continuing to have to reassure its neighbours in the region about its position on this. So this comments made by Senator Wong in April. Interestingly, these comments were made in Noumea, French overseas territory of New Caledonia, in which you can see there that Senator Wong is reassuring Pacific states that Australia will be complying with its obligations under the Treaty of Rarotonga. Now, most importantly, the Treaty of Rarotonga doesn't directly address the issue of nuclear-powered submarines being stationed in Australia. Nuclear-armed, it certainly does, but nuclear-powered, it's silent on that particular point. And you'll see that Senator Wong, in her statement, also talks about the importance of Australian compliance with the NPT. So, colleagues, that sort of is my survey of these issues. So, I guess by way of conclusions, Antarctica and the South Pacific have got a pretty significant nuclear-free track record. Obviously, when you look at those two regions, they've made major contributions to the development of nuclear-free zones as we understand them around the world. and they've been very successful in terms of maintaining the status of those areas as nuclear-free zones. Some of you might be aware, for example, that New Zealand has been so prominent in terms of its anti-nuclear position that it has barred US warships from entering New Zealand ports on any form of port visit because of New Zealand's position that the United States will neither confirm or deny that US warships are nuclear armed. And so that's been a bit of a tension between New Zealand and the United States. So the region has a very strong track record and takes a very strong position on these issues. But clearly, the AUKUS announcement has indicated that Pacific small island states are very nervous, are very concerned about these issues, that there's been a need for constant diplomatic reassurance to these small Pacific Island states about these particular issues, and also the rise of strategic competition in Antarctica and generally in the South Pacific, because another part of this narrative that I haven't really touched upon is growing concern about Chinese presence in the South Pacific, means that these regions are becoming theatres of strategic competition between major powers. And obviously, even though there is a nuclear-free compact in Antarctica and the South Pacific, there's always a potential that there could be a spillover of nuclear issues within the region. So that's my sort of analysis for things at the moment. And I think it's probably an area where we're going to see continued attention given to nuclear disarmament and nuclear-free zone issues in coming years. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for the highly informative presentation. To me, it's kind of eye-opening. I knew bits and pieces about it, but it was never presented in a coherent way. It's really fascinating and intriguing. Let me take the privilege to ask two sets of questions, and then we'll have a full discussion. One is it's quite informative. As you know, in 1979, September 21st, there was, I think by now it's fair to take it almost a factual claim that it was a very low yield atmospheric test. To this day, it's not fully clear by whom, allegedly by Israel, in the area of the vicinity of the Prince Edward Island, which is roughly half the distance between South Africa and Antarctica. On that island, there was a small South African station, scientific station. So my question about that, is it considered to be part of the zone that it's part of the Antarctica, it's outside? And to what extent, obviously it was in 1979, but to what extent what we have today could have prevented this legally, that kind of thing? So that's one question, and then I'll have another follow-up, and then we'll have a discussion.
So thank you for that question and for reminding me of that alleged incident. Prince Edward Island is, as you rightly say, approximately located halfway between South Africa and the Antarctic continent. Prince Edward Island is classified as being a sub-Antarctic island. And I'll just try to go back into my slides here. And a sub-Antarctic island is one that sits basically between the continents to the north and the Antarctic continent itself. And so it doesn't sit within the area of the Antarctic Treaty, which extends up to 60 degrees south. So it's beyond the Antarctic Treaty area. Okay. So it doesn't fall within the prohibitions of the Antarctic Treaty that I spoke about.
Yeah. In terms of mileage, what's the diameter of the zone that's considered to be Antarctica? How much mileage from the South Pole to the external zone, to the circle outside?
I think I'll have to take that question on notice.
You think it's hundreds of miles?
So can you just be precise?
I mean, from the center,
from the South Pole.
Center is the South Pole.
Yes.
And the circle, which is the territory which is considered to be the Antarctica.
Yes.
What's the distance?
Oh, it's probably something like 2,000 miles.
2,000.
Yes.
To each.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The other question is about the Chinese activities.
Yes.
To what extent, kind of following what I was asking before, to what extent they are coordinated with other powers within the treaty, to what extent they are completely independent, to what extent they are being seen or perceived as menacing because of some elements that are beyond peaceful. What's the...
So thank you for that question. The Antarctic Treaty is somewhat curious in the sense that the goal and objective of scientific research and scientific advancement is very much framed around a raison d'etre of scientific cooperation. That the scientists who are not politicians and are not diplomats and are not military people are really just interested in doing their science. And so to that end, there's a very strong history and ethos of scientific cooperation and collaboration. And indeed, without that collaboration, scientists would have died in a range of disasters that have occurred over the course of their scientific research throughout the last 120 years or so. So there's a strong ethos of collaboration and cooperation as occurs in many scientific endeavours around the world. And so interestingly enough, the Chinese were initially introduced to Antarctica by Australian research scientists. They were asked to join Australian scientific research expeditions. And as a result of that, they became engaged in Antarctic research. So there's quite a bit of collaborative research that the Chinese undertake with their other partners. But when they go ahead and establish these scientific research bases, those are very much solo activities. Those are activities that are directly funded by the Chinese government. And the objectives of that scientific research program is one that's meeting broad Antarctic research goals, but ultimately the goals of the Chinese state. And that's where a whole series of issues have been raised as to whether or not some of the activities are ones in which China is undertaking activities to try to determine the resources in Antarctica that might possibly be subject to mining at a point in the future, and also whether some of the research activities, while civil in nature, actually have a dual use and are really civil and military in dimension. And so that's the uncertainty, because the Chinese research program in some respects is quite opaque, and there's not a lot of clarity about what precisely they're doing there in terms of some of their bases.
So that's a follow-up question. Is there, when a country has scientific activities in its stations in Antarctica, is there a public agenda that you publish and you say what you do and the scientific nature of those kind of activities, or each country can do it even secretly or quietly or on your own without telling others what you're actually scientifically doing?
So historically, all of the research was published in the spirit of scientific endeavour and the development and growth of scientific knowledge. But once again, over time, where the scientific research has been seen to be more sensitive and to have had some strategic value, questions have been raised as to whether or not all of the research is being published, and the transparency associated with the programs. There's an interesting provision in the Antarctic Treaty which allows member states to inspect each other's scientific research bases. It's a compliance mechanism, not similar to nuclear activities. But the inspection system has been used regularly. It also incurs significant costs. So countries do not inspect each other's activities perhaps as frequently as they could, but there's a range of issues associated with that.
And it's presented in the word inspection or more scientific exchange or scientific collaboration?
No, the term inspection is directly referred to in the treaty.
Because it's kind of more, when you use the word inspection, it's kind of, you're more suspicious about the other side.
Yeah, but I think remembering that the treaty was negotiated at a time when there wasn't a secretariat. There is now, but there wasn't a secretariat. So it was really just a compliance mechanism to really basically make sure that everyone was complying with the provisions of the treaty. So you can see the intention behind it when it was written into the treaty in 1959, but whether it's a really effective mechanism today is really questionable.
Thank you. Let's open the discussion. Everybody here or somebody online? Lauren, is there anybody online that is?
We have some participants online, but nobody raising their hand else
Okay.
yet. Oh, I do have Angela Woodward raising her hand right now.
Please, Angela.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be with you today from Christchurch, New Zealand, home of Operation Deep Freeze, the US base in New Zealand. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Rothwell, for your presentation.
The picture behind you is a fake or it's the real thing behind you?
Sorry, this is my beach here in Christchurch. I just live 5 minutes from the beach. Can almost look out to Antarctica. Lovely to be with you today. I just had a few comments and a question for Professor Rothwell. I think it was very interesting, the New Zealand and Australian sort of coalition, against the French nuclear testing, which, fell apart in the mid-80s. And then New Zealand going on, of course, to become so fervently anti-disarmament, pro-disarmament in its diplomacy after the Rainbow Warrior bombing in Auckland Harbour, the French terrorist bombing, state-sponsored terrorist bombing of that vessel in New Zealand's territorial waters. And I think that really hardened New Zealand's position on nuclear diplomacy at a time when Australia then became a little more, went more with its allies, US and now UK, in moving towards more nuclear activities. And it's interesting that we see that, Australia still won't join the TPNW despite claims by the Albanese government that they will consider it. And in fact, some of the more hawkish Australian think tanks outlining pathways to nuclear acquisition, especially if there is proliferation in North Asia, further proliferation, especially Korea and Japan. So I think that's very interesting. But I wanted to pick out some of to hear more of your thoughts on how the compliance mechanism and verification system with the Antarctic Treaty may be strengthened. You've mentioned that the inspections may not be being used, and Avner, I agree with you very much. They should be called visits. There should be more reciprocity, more openness, and more confidence building. And so I see a problem that as we have more countries operating in the continent, undertaking more and more covert research, perhaps more dual use research, how can we harness new verification techniques and technologies, perhaps to achieve a better understanding of compliance, to encourage compliance, to help make states demonstrate their compliance? I really look forward to your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, and nice to see you coming in. Where'd you say you're coming in from? Christchurch?
Yes, I work for Vertic in the UK, but very, very remotely.
Okay. Well, look, your intervention might allow me to make another observation that has arisen from an exchange with a colleague in Christchurch just in the last 24 hours. But to directly answer your question, the difficulty that exists with the treaty is that the treaty is a relatively old treaty, 1959, and the inspection system that I described is embedded in the treaty. And as I said, when it was originally established, it was probably seen as perfectly appropriate in terms of having a compliance and monitoring function associated with it. And that dimension really tries to deal with compliance and monitoring predominantly with respect to scientific research and scientific activities and the provisions of Articles 1 and Article 5 that I've spoken about. There's a real contrast because the treaty has been modified by the Madrid Protocol from 1991, and it has very tough standards and procedures and compliance requirements with respect to meeting the environmental obligations that exist under the treaty. But that's a separate category to the issues that you're raising and the ones that I'm discussing. So the whole issue of the inspection system is one that has been seen as a weakness that exists within the treaty system, but it also raises sovereignty tensions. So obviously, the Argentinians will be somewhat reluctant, or there'll be tensions about them deciding that they want to inspect a British base on Antarctica. You can imagine those sort of tensions that would arise. And even today, notwithstanding that we're some distance away from the Falklands War, there are still those sort of tensions that exist between those two countries in Antarctica. So I think the only way that you can try to see this easily resolved is for really countries to say, well, look, we think having a compliance and an inspection system for the types of issues that we're discussing in this seminar is important, and therefore we're going to invest more money in it. And actually, it ultimately becomes a budgetary issue as to whether or not the various Antarctic programs are able to do so, working within the treaty system framework and the inspection system that I've been discussing. Otherwise, to try to ensure higher levels of compliance with respect to some of these dual-use military-type activities, it's really the role of civil society, and civil society has been doing some good work on that. The media have been doing some interesting work on that, and I've worked with media outlets in Australia and South Africa who've been raising and looking at some of these questions. But to try to enhance those processes using a treaty framework, I think will be quite challenging. And I think there's an important aspect of that which always needs to be recalled, and that is that any decision-making within the Antarctic Treaty has to be by consensus. And so that is often seen as a way in which any advancement on some of these issues, toughening up some of these measures, would fail. Does that answer your question on that point?
Yes. So in other words, it's very difficult and probably won't be achieved if it's left to civil society. Civil society verification has limits.
Yeah. So let me just raise the issue about New Zealand and AUKUS. For those of you who are not aware, Angela will be aware, of course, there's been a New Zealand election on Saturday, and there's been a change of government in New Zealand with a Conservative government being elected. During the course of 2023, there's been an interesting debate emerging as to whether or not New Zealand, along with Canada, might become partners in AUKUS. Now, there needs to be some further understanding here that Australia, New Zealand, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada are part of what's called the Five Eyes surveillance network, an intelligence sharing network. So it's obvious that there would be some discussions about whether Canada and New Zealand could possibly be brought into AUKUS. And so this has gained some debate and traction over the last few months. And certainly the United States has said that they're more than willing to consider bringing in other AUKUS partners. And New Zealand and Canada would be obvious partners. But if New Zealand was to become an AUKUS partner, I'm not in any way suggesting that it would do so on the basis of acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, but there are other pillars of AUKUS which New Zealand might be quite interested in terms of cybersecurity, intelligence sharing, and other aspects to really beef up New Zealand's capability in terms of these matters. So that'll be an interesting development, but I don't think that New Zealand will be changing its anti-nuclear position anytime soon, I don't think.
So AUKUS is much larger than just simply a submarine-based kind of deal. It's strategic and it has other aspects.
Yes. Yep.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a very insightful and informative talk. I learned a lot. My question might not be directly related to Antarctica and the treaty, but it has got a lot to do with AUKUS and how things are panning out. A lot has been said about AUKUS by ASEAN countries, and I'm mentioning that because part of the implications of AUKUS could be an intensified great power competition between China, US, and obviously Australia bringing the fulcrum. And if, as in one of your last slides, you said that strategic competition would vitiate the environment in this region as well. So how does Australia navigate criticisms about and of AUKUS, especially from the ASEAN countries, because ASEAN and China are having the best of times right now, and that could have an impact on this region.
Thank you for that question. So I guess just to clarify, and I've brought up this slide again to remind us all that there is a nuclear-free zone that exists within ASEAN, the Treaty of Bangkok, of course. But we always need to recall that under both the Treaty of Bangkok and also the Treaty of Rarotonga, there's no prohibition on the navigation of vessels. And that was critical in terms of how those treaties were concluded. And so neither treaty places any prohibition on the navigation of either a nuclear-armed or a nuclear-powered warship. And as an academic and as a law of the sea scholar, I would point out that there are nuclear-armed and nuclear-powered warships passing through Southeast Asia all the time. They're predominantly flying American flags, but they do it all the time. And so my sense of the reaction to AUKUS from ASEAN states has been a bit of an overreaction because they don't seem to acknowledge the fact that the United States has been doing this for a long time, as have other major nuclear powers. However, the point that you make that Australia acquiring these AUKUS submarine capabilities adds to something of an arms race within the region, I think is a legitimate point. And that's clearly been a legitimate point of concern within the region because rightly or wrongly, most analysts and commentators and other states are saying, well, why is Australia doing this? Well, Australia is doing this as a counterpoint to China, and Australia is closely allied with the United States. And so this is a counterbalance to China's rise within the region. So I accept that point, I acknowledge that point, and I acknowledge that concern that exists within the ASEAN states on that particular issue.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question is related to nuclear reactors on Antarctica, and you specifically mentioned McMurdo, the nuclear reactor was shut down due to criticism. My question is, was it illegal, and would it be illegal now to place a peaceful nuclear reactor on the continent? And do you foresee that as a possibility now with countries developing sort of micro reactors or floating nuclear power plants to power remote facilities?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think my legal analysis would be to say that at the time that the United States established the reactor at McMurdo, there was nothing inappropriate about it. The treaty didn't directly deal with nuclear-powered stations or nuclear energy capability. So to that end, there was nothing that breached the treaty. However, what we now have in place, as I alluded to, is the provisions of the Madrid Protocol, and the Madrid Protocol to the Antarctic Treaty create a whole series of very strict environmental standards. So any proposal by a state to use any nuclear energy type capability would, I think, immediately raise that issue. So, you know, if you decide to construct an offshore wind farm in Antarctica, that would raise environmental issues. If you decided to build a whole series of solar arrays in Antarctica, that would raise an environmental issue. So I think what I'm saying to you is that we now need to see any of those types of proposals within the context of the Madrid Protocol. And in answer to my earlier question, the Madrid Protocol has actually got much stronger compliance and monitoring standards than some other aspects of the treaty. And before a state is able to put forward a proposal like that, it needs to go through a whole series of environmental impact assessments, and it needs to be assessed and reviewed by a fairly strong environmental committee that exists within the treaty systems. That's the sort of process that would arise. But I think you've raised an interesting question as to the potential for that being explored into the future, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Thank you. Any follow-up? It's okay?
Oh, yeah, perfect.
Any other questions? Maybe I'll have just simply another question of information and curiosity. You mentioned something about the secretariat that exists right now. Can you say something about it, how it works, how it's managed, who are the membership, how big is that organ?
This is for the Antarctic Treaty?
All right.
Yes, okay. So the treaty didn't envisage a secretariat at all. It didn't.
So it means it didn't have any enforcement mechanisms?
No. It did, however, make provision for a COP type process, a conference of parties or a meeting of parties. And to that end, the practice has been that there was a 2-yearly cycle in terms of treaty meetings, and then it became a yearly cycle. But as a result of the treaty's complexity growing with the addition of all of the additional instruments that I've spoken about, it was realised that there would need to be some sort of secretariat. So that resulted in much political debate and discussion, and eventually agreement was reached on a secretariat being located in Buenos Aires in Argentina, which had to navigate the Falklands sort of issue with the United Kingdom. But the secretariat is really more of a clearinghouse than anything else. It really just provides a repository in terms of the multitude of documents that are generated within the Antarctic Treaty system. It provides a secretariat for the annual meetings, but it has relatively weak procedures and mechanisms, and certainly doesn't equate to the types of secretariats or COP functions that we see for other more modern treaty bodies.
Essentially, it's a post office kind of thing.
Very much so. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting. Any other question? Wonder if so many thanks. It has been fascinating. We learned a great deal, and we're very much grateful.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you.